It's always a privilege to introduce someone. I first became aware of Dr. Buckingham over 15 years ago when I first moved east, and I was just pastoring this little country church with 20 or 25 people on a Sunday morning, and people were talking about, have you heard what Moncton Wesleyan Church is doing? Have you heard what Dr. Buckingham's doing? And if I'm honest, there was kind of this, if you will, hero worship. I was like, if you're a hockey player, you look up to the greats. Well, as a pastor, you look up to the ones that have done the work, that have been faithful. And it doesn't get more faithful than 44 years in a single place serving the Lord. And it's not my place to tell his story, but I'm just so grateful that he saw something in me worth investing in. And so grateful that he came to invest in you. And so I just ask you to welcome him as he comes and just honor him. He's the director of the Buckingham Leadership Institute at Kingswood University. And just the most humble guy probably I've ever met. He doesn't come in saying, I know the answer. He comes in saying, help me understand, and encourages, and I hope you'll be encouraged this morning. Would you come?
Great to be here, guys. Well, it is wonderful to be here. Now, just about every speaker gets up and says that kind of thing, but I mean it. This morning, I've had a great opportunity to meet with a lot of people over the last couple of days, and I haven't had one thing said to me that's been discouraging. It's all been encouraging, and it just makes me feel good to be able to be here, to be a part of what you are wanting to do. I know that anything I say today will be everything that you want to see happen, as I have been able to interview a lot of people and have the focus group, and then had a great time here yesterday morning with a wonderful group of people. And and it's kind of like coming back home in a way, because even though we're not that far away from here, there's so many people we know in this part of the world. And so it's just great to see you all. And I am so thankful for your pastoral team. And I know you know this, I don't need to remind you, but God has given you a great pastoral team. And there's going to be, yes, and a great bunch of people for them to be able to work with because of your passion and your vision. And so I'm just grateful for that. Now, I'm going to try to speed up this process. I see the clock ticking back here. When I first started preaching, I was called, believe it or not, the master of brevity. That's when I first started. And but what happened, and this is a true story, in a business meeting, an elderly lady with a little bit of an edge made a motion. She said, I move that our pastor be required to preach longer sermons. She said, we're not getting our money's worth out of those short sermons. So I want you to get your money's worth this morning, you understand. And I think you'll want that to happen, I'm sure. Well, there's a verse of Scripture. I'm going to kind of jump right in here real quick. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39, and it's about Jesus, of course, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we would all be aware of that. Most of us here would be, at least, where he was facing the cross. And it says he went a little further, and he got on his face and he prayed. And he said, not my will, but your will be done. And friends, in order for us to see the Church of Jesus Christ grow, glow, go to the glory of God, it may mean for every one of us that we will need to go a little further. Maybe a little further than we ever wanted to go. Maybe a little further than we ever thought we could go, or even maybe a little further than we even thought we should go, or ever dreamed it were possible for us to go. But it may mean going a little further. And the wonderful thing that I see about Jesus, that I think if we're to be a true 100% follower of Jesus, it will be the same for us. It wasn't about him and his will. It wasn't about what he liked or what he wanted. It was about doing the will of the Father. A statesperson is somebody who has a vision for the greater good, regardless of how it impacts them personally. Jesus, then, was the greatest statesperson who ever lived, because he had a vision for the cross that was put before him, God's vision, and it was for the greater good of all of mankind. And so he was willing to go a little further that we might be here this morning. And oftentimes in the church world, without people thinking it through, when push comes to shove, and it's a decision between what I like and my selfishness and my selfish desires and what I'm comfortable with, as opposed to what is his will and what is for the greater good, our will ends up winning out. And that is not being a true follower of Christ. I think the epitome of a disciple, 100% follower of Christ, is that person who is willing to say, whether I like what's being done or not, whether it's in my best interest or not, but it's for the greater good, I'm 100% for it. There's a principle called the principle of the slight edge, and it goes something like this. Those who excel over the masses do so only slightly. In fact, it means they just win a little further. I mean, people who win in the Olympics, sometimes it's by a fraction of a second, but they just worked a little harder, prepared a little more, trained a little more, did whatever they do, and so they won. And so if we're going to win in this greatest battle of all battles and this most important cause of all causes, it may mean that we'll go a little further than what we wanted to go. And when we come to that point where there is that willingness with Jesus, it was a total surrender to the will of God. And when we can come to that point where there's that kind of willingness, then I'll tell you what, God is ready, willing, and wanting to pour out his blessing on that kind and that type of a group of people. And I really think he's ready and wanting to do that in a way that you can hardly believe. I just feel like I have got a vision for this place, even though this is not where I attend or whatever, but this place has the potential to be a lighthouse for all of Albert County, and this place has the potential to be one of the greatest churches in all of Atlantic Canada as far as winning souls and see them getting established in the faith and seeing people baptized for the size of the community of any church in Atlantic Canada. An amen would be good. But we'll need, maybe, most likely, to go a little further. When I first went to Moncton 47 years ago, I was greeted by a famous pastor and evangelist who said this to me. He said, Laurel, Moncton has been preached over and preached over. It's gospel hardened. And nobody's ever going to see anything of any consequence ever happen in this city ever again. Wasn't that exciting to get that kind of welcome? And then I have to say, I mean, it sure did take going a little further, but I just refused to buy into that. And of course, that takes faith and believing and all the rest. And so then our church began to grow and things began to happen. And a pastor friend of mine in Halifax, he said, Laurel, you got it made in Moncton. Why, he said, in Moncton there's an evangelical climate and people are open and they're receptive to the gospel. But he said, in Halifax, you can't see things happen in Halifax like what you can see happen in Moncton. So everywhere you go, people are saying it can't be done, right? But they're being proven wrong by those who are doing it because they're willing to go a little further and be in the will of God. But we have to believe, or it's not going to happen. And there in many ways, there was not much around in Atlantic Canada in those days that would cause you to believe. But I just believed if we did the right thing, that God would honor that. And believing is so much a major part of getting anything. If we don't believe it can be done, then it's sure never going to be done. True? If we don't believe it's going to be, there's no hope in the world of ever being done. So it's a matter of Having that faith like Jesus, the scripture says the power of the Lord was present to heal them. And because of that power, men brought this man to Jesus. And it says because of their what? Faith, he healed them. You know, if you don't respond well to when I'm preaching, I have to come up with an illustration or repeat what I'm saying. It's going to take longer and so on and so on. But I remember being in Iowa for a conference out there speaking, and a guy told me about a salesman who was selling milking machines to farmers. And he went to this, and he had a guy that would travel with him, and they went to this one place where this guy only had one cow. And his friend said, "You're not going to try to sell a milking machine to a man that's only got one cow." Oh, he said, "You better know him." He said, "Well, I'm not going in there with you." So the guy went in, came out with a big smile in his face. His friend said, "You did not sell that man a milking machine." He said, "You better know I did." And he said, "I took the cow in as a down payment." Well, really and truly, there are all kinds of obstacles, really and truly, that would make us think that it can't be done. But I'll tell you what, when people have that faith that drives them to go a little further than they've ever gone, a little further than they ever wanted to go, then God will meet us there and we'll see things happen. As we look at Jesus, I want you to notice that surrender, of course. And I want you to notice three things about that surrender, and you'll be able to remember these. The three things about that surrender: there was a place of that surrender, there was a price of that surrender, and then there was, as a result of that, the peace that came from that surrender. And that's what can happen in the church today as we're willing to get in the place. And I want you to notice two things about this place where Jesus went. It was a place of prayer. The calmness of the place, that's one thing. The clearness of the plan that was there. Once he got into that calm place, away from the voices that he could have heard from his disciples, but hear the one voice that he needed to hear above every other voice. And that was the voice of God. And he got in that place. And that place of prayer is a place of power. And so I don't know about you, I love to be in an atmosphere, wherever it may be, especially if it's in a place like this, where you just feel it. I mean, you just sense there is a power there that is far beyond the capability of any person. There is a power there that is taking over. And one of the things that happens with me now when I preach, I used to have to try to figure out what to say. Now I have to figure out what not to say. And so things come into my mind as I'm preaching, especially when people respond like you guys are responding this morning. And so I'll just make this as brief as I know how to make it. When I first started preaching, I went to this place, couldn't preach, didn't have any sermons. And have you ever heard of a preacher getting up to preach when you couldn't figure out what he was talking about? You know? Have you ever heard of a preacher get up to preach and he didn't even know what he was talking about? Well, that was what was happening in this place where I was asked to go for special meetings. Hadn't been to Bible college to learn how to preach and so on. But got out there and it was just as bad as you could possibly imagine. But I'm to make a long story short. There's a lot, if I could have had the time to tell the story, it's a great story. But anyway, the power of the Lord came over that place. And I was in that place for 4 weeks. And we saw people saved every week and baptized out where there were no people. We had 300 people show up for a baptism. The power of the Lord present to heal them. And that's what we all want to see. I remember hearing about D.L. Moody, the great evangelist of the 1800s, was speaking in England, and he was in one of the very formal churches there, and this woman came up to him after he finished speaking. He wasn't that educated, but God's power was with him. And this woman came up to him and said, "Mr. Moody, I noticed in your sermon this morning 14 grammatical errors." Mr. Moody said, "Why, sister, that's all the Lord gave me." He said, "If he'd given me more, I'd use those too." Well, God blessed Moody in spite of his grammatical errors. I remember hearing, and this is a friend of mine told me, he was listening to this guy on the radio. This is in the South, and the guy was preaching its education. And he said, this education, it's of the devil. D-E-V-O-L. Well, some of you may need a little more yourselves. You didn't get that. But anyway, regardless, if the power of the Lord is present, then it can compensate for a lot of weaknesses on man's part. And that's what comes when we get into that place of prayer, as we saw Jesus making that the priority. Then we see not only the calm place, but we see the clear plan that was put before him. You know, the plan to go to the cross. Let this cup pass from me, but not my will. And so in order for the church to be all that the church, all God meant for the church to be, we have got to have, above every other organization in the world, we should have a clear plan of action. A clear plan that is, there's no fuzziness about it. A clear plan that people buy. You know what I happen to believe? And I've felt this way for 50 years. I've been preaching for 55 now. I happen to believe that the church of Jesus Christ ought to be the most alive, the most energized, the most exciting, the most dynamic, the most creative, the most innovative place on the face of the earth. It was my goal that in our city, that the church have more of an impact than any business or anything else in the city. And when we were able to build a 2,000-seat auditorium, which became the largest auditorium of any kind in Atlantic Canada, it was more that it made a statement. The church does not have to be the cow's tail. We can be in the forefront to the glory of God. But it means going a little further. Getting into that place, that calm place, to get the clear plan. You know, I do this all the time now, what I'm doing here. I say all the time, a lot of the time, not all the time, but anyway. And I get in some pretty dead spots. In fact, most of them are. And people who are unwilling to come up with a new plan. They want to use the plans that were used 50, 75 years ago and wonder why the thing is failing. You know, we tend to spiritualize methods. Someone put it this way: nothing fails like success. We've always heard nothing succeeds like success. They say nothing fails today. What is meant by that? Nothing fails today like the successes of yesterday. In other words, some of the things in the Church of Jesus Christ that had the most glorious, wonderful, powerful impact 50, 75 years ago, if we keep trying to do those things and revive those things, those are the very things that can cause failure today. Because we have got to learn the language of the culture. The cultures continually change. And so somehow or another we've got to speak the language. We'll speak not just the people inside here. The big, important, most critical factor is to speak the language of the people who are out there that need Jesus more than they need anything else in this world. And so that's what it takes. It's going a little further and trying to figure all of that out. But so many churches I go to, they've done the same old for 50, 75, 100, 200 years. But there's an upside to it. There's an upside to it. If 1955 ever rolls around again, they will be ready. You know, I was born and brought up on a farm and in Carleton County, which is maybe not quite up to Albert County. I wouldn't say that anywhere else, but since I'm in Albert County, I better be careful. But anyway, my whole family lived on that farm. My father, since he was 5 years old, 8 of his siblings were born in the same house I was born in, along with my brothers born in that same house. And when they first arrived there, for many years, they drank water out of a spring. And you know, let me just preface what I'm going to say by saying this. In order to be alive physically, we've got to have water. We're going to die without water. In order to be alive spiritually, We've got to have truth. And we'll die without the truth. And so, I just can't imagine 9 people in that family, 11 counting the parents, and having to cart water from a spring that was a fair distance away. Well, then there came a time where they got a pump, which was not so far away from the house. And that's what I remember when I came around. And then electricity came through when I was 8 years old, and they were able to drill a well next to the house and have an electric pump. I'll tell you, I can hear my father saying, you know, I wish it was the good old days when we used to have to cart water from that spring, you know, and all this. Now, can you imagine him saying that? No, everybody was thrilled to death that there was greater accessibility to the water. The water didn't change, but the way of getting the water into the home and into all of us did change. And I'll tell you what, my friends, the only way that truth that we want that world to hear out there, the only way that that truth is going to have any impact on that world out there is for it to be as accessible to that world out there as it can possibly be. And we'll need to use the latest methods and the most modern means in music and in everything else that we possibly can to make sure that that truth is accessible. And that may mean going a little further, getting a clear plan. And then we see the price. It was a big price for Jesus. There's 2 things about that price of going to the cross and for him as he was headed for the cross. There was a word of refusal. No, this was the word from God. You are going to need to do what you said you'd be willing to do. There was a word of refusal in order to do the most important thing of all, the work of redemption. And in the process of getting done what needs to get done, in the process of going a little further than we've ever gone and further than we ever thought we were able to go or could go or should go even maybe, there may be words of refusal. There may be people who don't understand. We just have to be ready for that and not be surprised by it. And there's people, especially as people get older, it's difficult for them to change in a way that things need to be changed if we're going to get the truth out there and speak the language of the culture. And so when I first went to Moncton, oh my word, the opposition that we received as we had this vision and had this belief that our church, first Sunday I was there, we had 65 people. Little church downtown that sat on a piece of property. That's the only property we had was the property the building sat on. No parking, no nothing. So you can imagine what all had to transpire to get all this done, and people who didn't understand. In fact, there were some people who were so upset with me. One person got up a petition to circulate to vote me out. And I was, this was back now a long time ago, but I was going through such difficulty and was tormented so by all the problems that we were dealing with and the rejections that we were having to face and the pushback and the people who didn't understand and the problem imaginating, trouble predicting, failure visualizing, obstacle envisioning Pharisees that we had to deal with. And it was just one awful trauma to go through all of that. And so when I heard about this petition, because I wanted to go more than anybody else wanted me to go, I signed the petition. But here's something as we think of the need to go a little further. I love being inspired. Don't you like being inspired? I love reading inspirational books. I love, most of all, listening to inspirational preaching. And I love being inspired. But you know something? Inspiration is the worst fuel on which to run the spiritual motor. Now let me explain that. It's the very worst fuel. Because the minute you come up against rejection, inspiration evaporates. And it's gone, and you're not one bit further ahead. So what is the fuel? I'll tell you what the fuel is. that's going to keep that spiritual mower and that spiritual fire and that spiritual perseverance and that spiritual sense of determination and that willingness, not my will but your will. It is commitment. Like Nehemiah had when he said, what God had put in my heart to do, and then he saw the broken down walls, and that's the reason I'm doing what I'm doing. I just see the broken down walls in so many places of the church. And then he said, we will arise and we will build. And nobody got any more pushback than Nehemiah. He had enemies on the outside, he had enemies on the inside, but he said, we will do what is right to do because it's right to do. And I'll tell you what, my friends, when we have an army like we have in this auditorium today, who are prepared and committed and say, we will do whatever has to be done. We will go a little further no matter what the price. We will get in that calm place to hear the clear plan, and we will face the words of rejection in order to do the work of redemption. That's the church that God is going to honor and bless in an unbelievable way. You don't seem convinced, so I got to tell you a story. I remember hearing about this pastor, a black pastor. I love preaching in black churches. My word, they make a wild man out of me because they just respond. They repeat after you. They amen you all the way through. I just go crazy when I preach in a black church. And so he went to this church that was kind of dead, and he couldn't seem to get it going. And so he stood before the congregation this morning, figured he hadn't anything to lose. He said, this church, it's been sitting too long. They said, oh yeah, we've been sitting too long. He said, this church, it needs to walk. They said, oh yeah, let her walk. Let her walk. He said, and he was getting a little bit encouraged by their response. He said, this church, it needs to march. They said, oh yeah, let her march. Let her march. And then he was really getting encouraged. So he said, this church, it needs to run. And they are coming on stronger. They said, oh yeah, let her run. Let her run. So he was so fired up, he went for the big one. He said, this church, it needs to fly. They said, oh yeah, let her fly. Let her fly. He said, it costs money to fly. They said, let her sit. Let her sit. Did you all get the point? The price is costly. It's going to cost us sacrificing some of our own comforts. Some of the things that we like, that has been this way for 50, 75 years, or whatever the case may be, that may no longer speak the language of the culture. You know, people asked me over the years, I don't know how many times I had this question asked, say, what keeps the Moncton West Church going forward? Well, it didn't always. There were times we'd have to reinvent ourselves, learn the language of the culture of today, and then head off again. But it kind of kept going in this direction over the period of time. And so I would say, I said, look, it's complicated. It's complex. There's a lot to it. But if you're forcing me to give you a simple answer, this would be the simple answer. Our people have come to a place where they moved from a selfish agenda, went a little further to an unselfish agenda. Now, what does that mean? They're thinking totally away from the agenda of, is this what I like? Is this what I enjoy? Is this what I've always been used to? Is this my cup of tea? They got away from the agenda, me, 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 me. To an agenda whether I like it or not, whether I'm comfortable with it or not, whether I enjoy it or not, whether it's my cup of tea or not, whether it's something that I really love, whether I don't care, as long as it's helping us to get people to Jesus Christ, I am going to be for it. And I'll tell you what, that's when things can happen. When people have that very attitude. You know, as I would say to our people over and over again, there's only one thing that never changes in this church, and that's that everything is always changing. And it has to be if we're going to speak the language of the culture. On so many different fronts, and I'm not wanting to pick on the music front. I really enjoyed the worship here this morning. It has nothing to do with what I heard here this morning, but so many places, that is a hindrance to getting the message out there. We're not speaking the language of the youth, not speaking the language of young families and young adults, and wonder why. And then older people who are willing to change, they'll sit around and complain about no young people. And they're the very reason that there aren't any young people, because they're not willing to change. How do you like me now? So, I want to read something to you. Let's bury this religious stiffness. Get it out of the way. We want to be just as free and natural in the meetings as we are outside the meetings. Another thing, to have fresh interest in our churches. I believe we have somehow got to have new music. I don't object to the old hymns. And by the way, people need to be spoken to who are older in their language as well. So it's not either or, it's both and. I don't object to the old hymns. They're good in their place. But when you come to hear them over and over again, they lose their freshness. They don't take hold. They've been singing them in a good many churches year in and year out. And the result is young people have lost all interest. Young people like freshness, right? They like something that's alive. They like freshness. And so he says, I don't know why we should not have some new songs, new music to wake up fresh interest in our churches. Throw some life and energy into it. A man that doesn't throw life and energy into his business soon becomes bankrupt. I believe it's to follow the leader, etc., etc. That was written in 1894 by the great evangelist D.L. Moody. Same old, same old. These things have been a challenge forever and ever. But you know, the only difference between now and then is the culture is changing even faster today than it was back then. And so we're willing to face a word of rejection. And I just had another thought come into my mind. I'm trying to keep these thoughts out because we got to quit here someday. But there's one church that was dead. And they went in and did the thing we're doing. And they realized they're going to have change an awful lot of things. And one of the biggest things they're going to have change is the music. If they're going to reach the youth and the young families and so on and so on. There was elderly people primarily in that church. And so they brought in this loud music. You know, it's not really working with young people and young adults unless it's pounding you in the chest. You know, I was in First Baptist Church in Orlando, and I could feel it right here. And the music was so loud that my bulletin was shaking. But the place was packed with young families and young adults glorifying God and into it and having a great time. Well, anyway, so there were these elderly ladies that sat back at the back of the church. And they would come in and all sit in their row, and there was one that always sat in the middle. And she had a plastic bag of cotton balls. So she would pass them out to these other elderly ladies. They'd stuff them in their ears. The music would start, and they'd get right into it and go for it. What an attitude. What an attitude. Willing to go a little further in order to do the great work that God has called us to do, the work of redemption. When people would say to me things about some things in our church they didn't like, I said, I don't like it either. But what's that got to do with anything? Has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with you. It's whether or not we are reaching people for Jesus. That's what it's got to do with. All right. The price. And now the peace that comes from paying the price. And this is what's really the fun part. Because we see there was a ceasing of the battle, because he said, he went to his disciples. I just see him in a relaxed mode in that scripture as he went to his disciples, and I think he just calmly said, okay, the battle's over, let's be going now. And now he was going to face the cross, willing to go a little further. That was a big issue, the willingness. And that's a big issue with most of us whenever we come up against these things. And so the ceasing of the battle. And, I have this view, doesn't mean I'm right, this is just my own personal view, that you don't get unity by trying to get unity. It usually causes more disunity because everybody gets their focus on unity and they want it all their way. Unity is a byproduct of something else. It's kind of like happiness. You don't get happiness by going after happiness for yourself. That's a selfish thing. It's when you seek to make other people happy. And so unity comes in. We probably had, I know at least 5 different factions in that church, and probably a lot more. People all kinds of different backgrounds who came in and received Christ and were transformed, but they had different backgrounds and different ideas about different things and the way things should be done and all that. But you know something? As far as I know, in the last many years, 35 years, I would say, there have been no fighting factions. And you know why there are no fighting factions? It's when people get a focus on making the main thing, then they get their eyes off of themselves and off of their little ideas and get their eyes onto something that is far, far, far more important. And that brings them together. That brings them together in unity and in harmony. The ceasing of the battle, the commencing of the blessing. Got to tell you this. We just saw so many people come to Christ and get transformed in so many wonderful stories. The Sunday before we finished at the church, we had a baptism in which we baptized 101 born-again people. The first person I ever baptized was this pretty woman down here. You've heard there's a movie, Pretty Woman, in there, but it's not quite the same idea. There's Pretty Woman down here. And by the way, she's prettier now than she was 52 years ago when we were married. 53 years ago this summer. She's the first person I ever baptized. The last person I ever baptized as a pastor was my 9-year-old granddaughter. That was number 101. So you talk about the commencing of the blessing. And listen, that whole thing of all those people being baptized that day, the rejoicing, the joy, the thrill, the celebration, the excitement, the satisfaction, whatever price had to be paid was worth every bit of it in order to see that kind of thing happen. Brother, I am circling the field, looking for a place. Don't pick up the mic yet. I'm circling the field, looking for a place to land. It's a little foggy, so you've got to pray for the fog to lift, and then I can come in for a landing. But I just got just one other thing. Keep flying, brother. Oh, thank you, Mr. Air Traffic Controller. I appreciate that. But a guy by the name of Peter Apples fought in the Civil War, and I don't know which side he was on, but anyway, the command was given by his commanding officer to advance. Well, they started to advance, but the enemy was too much for them. So the command was given to retreat. But Peter Apples was one of those type. He was not the retreating kind. He was a go a little further kind. And he somehow got across no man's land to where all the enemy soldiers were lined up in a trench, and he didn't get killed in the process, and he jumped down in the trench. He made contact with the first enemy soldier he saw, knocked him out cold, threw him up on the ground, put the enemy soldier over his shoulder, and was going back across no man's land toward his own company with all the enemy guns pointed at him, but they didn't dare to shoot for fear they'd shoot their own man. And he got over to where his commanding officer, who didn't even know he'd gone over there, where his commanding officer was, and he threw, can you imagine, just if you picture this, he threw this enemy soldier down in front of his commanding officer, and his commanding officer, in shock, looked at him and said, "Where did you get him?" "Oh," he said, "over yonder there." He said, "There's plenty of them over there." He said, "You could have all had one if you'd wanted one." And let me say, there's plenty of people out there in this world that need Jesus more than they need anything else in this world. And as everybody in this place is prepared to be like Jesus, not my will, not me, but you and your purpose, and go a little further. One of these days, we're going to see this place overflowing so that you'll have to either kick out the walls or rebuild. As you see children's ministry flying and go. You know, let's look back in the Old Testament. Look what happened. See Joseph in the pit. Then look at him, second in command in Egypt. He went a little further, didn't he? See Daniel in the lion's den. Look a little further. He's in the prime minister's chair. He went a little further. Look at the apostles being laughed at and scorned. And then they go out because they are willing to go a little further and turn the world upside down. Because they were willing to get in that place, to pay the price in order to get the joy and peace that comes when we're all willing to go a little further.